In the summer of 2024, heavy machinery began cutting into a sea dike on the coast of Friesland in the Netherlands. Excavators removed earth. Steel sheet piling surrounded the recovery area. Engineers watched a temporary water barrier that now had to perform the protective job of the section of dike being opened. But the objective was not to repair a pipe, replace a gate, or strengthen a foundation. Beneath the dike was a British bomber. It had been there since the early hours of June 26, 1943. To reach it, the Dutch first had to remove almost 100 meters of the structure protecting the coast from the sea. The aircraft was Vickers Wellington HE346 of 166 Squadron, Royal Air Force. 5 men had been aboard when it disappeared. None returned. For 81 years, the Wellington remained buried in the coastal ground. Then, after decades of partial searches, fragments, records, and unanswered questions, a recovery team prepared to dig down through the dike and into the place where the aircraft had vanished. The story began far from Friesland, on the other side of the North Sea. On the evening of June 25, 1943, HE346 was at RAF Kyrmington in Lincolnshire. It was a Wellington Mark X, one of the twin-engined bombers still serving with Bomber Command as the air war over Germany intensified. Its crew that night numbered 5. Charles Alfred Mattress, an Australian serving as the pilot, Alfred Mortimer, the navigator, John Peter Priestley, the bomb aimer, Norman Ronald Perry, the wireless operator and air gunner, and Thomas Ball, the rear gunner. Late that evening, at about 11:38, HE346 took off from Kyrmington as part of a large raid against Gelsenkirchen in the Ruhr. More than 470 aircraft were dispatched. The Wellington was not alone, and its mission was not unusual for Bomber Command in the summer of 1943. Crews crossed the North Sea, entered defended airspace over occupied Europe, navigated toward the industrial Ruhr, and then had to find their way home through darkness, weather, anti-aircraft fire, and German night fighters. By the end of the operation, 30 aircraft would be recorded missing. HE346 was one of them. On the return journey, the Wellington crossed the northern Netherlands in the early hours of June 26th. Later loss records credit Hauptmann Rudolf Sigmund of the German night fighter force with shooting it down. The records do not preserve the final seconds inside HE346 in detail. What is known is where the flight ended. Near Holwert, close to the Waddensee coast, the Wellington came down into soft, saturated ground. The surface evidence afterward was surprisingly slight for the loss of an entire bomber. Local records described a water-filled impact area and scattered aircraft material. There was no recognizable Wellington lying across a field, no largely intact fuselage waiting to be dismantled, and no visible group of 5 airmen who could be recovered and buried. The aircraft had gone down into the earth. The coastal clay and mud did not simply hold the wreck on the surface. The impact drove major parts of HE346 deeply into the ground, leaving investigators with fragments above and a far larger question below. All 5 crewmen were missing. For their families and for official records, that was the immediate end of the mission. For the aircraft itself, it was the beginning of a much longer burial. After the war, the crash site remained known locally, but knowing where an aircraft had gone in was not the same as being able to recover it. A reported attempt was made in 1952. Details of that effort are sparse, but the result is clear. HE346 remained in the ground. More than 20 years passed. Then, in 1977, major work on the sea dike brought the wreck back into the story. During the project, aircraft material appeared again. Recovery specialists from the Royal Netherlands Air Force investigated the site. Among the finds were wreckage and small quantities of human remains. One group of fragments was especially useful. The Wellington had been built using Vickers' distinctive geodetic construction, an interwoven lattice of structural members that gave the airframe a pattern unlike the more conventional internal framework of many other aircraft. A fragment of that lattice could identify the type even when the surrounding wreckage no longer resembled an airplane. The buried aircraft was a Wellington. Recognizing the type was one thing. Identifying this particular Wellington was another. The 1977 work did not become a complete excavation. The crash site remained difficult, and the dike itself continued to change. As the sea defense was strengthened, more material was placed over the area. The aircraft that had buried itself in coastal mud in 1943 was now being buried a second time by post-war engineering. The stronger the dike became, the harder the wreck was to reach. Identification continued above ground. Local researchers worked through records and physical clues connected with the site. Around 1991, one small object became especially important. It was a gold signet ring carrying the initials JP. Those initials matched John Peter Priestley, the bomb aimer aboard HE346. According to the later local historical account, Priestley's widow recognized the ring as one that had been given to him for his 18th birthday. Researchers also found reference to an earlier item, a flying glove carrying Priestley's name. Together with the location, the Wellington structure, the wartime loss records, and the history of the crash, the evidence increasingly pointed toward one aircraft, HE346. The wreck now had an identity that could be tied to 5 specific men. In June 1992, a memorial to the crew was unveiled at the dike. For anyone standing there, the story had 2 levels: above ground were the names, below ground were the aircraft, and, potentially, the missing crew. But identification had not solved the physical problem. The Wellington remained beneath a functioning sea defense. Recovering it would mean doing far more than bringing in an excavator and digging a hole. For decades, that remained the central obstacle. Then, 2 modern projects began to overlap. The Netherlands developed a national program aimed at recovering promising Second World War aircraft wrecks, where missing aircrew might still be present. At the same time, the Holwert to Turnard section of the sea dike was due for major strengthening work. For the first time, a full recovery of HE346 could be coordinated with construction already planned on the structure above it. The objective was not to restore the Wellington to flying condition. The aircraft had struck the ground violently and spent more than 8 decades buried beneath coastal clay and later construction. The principal objective was human. Search the crash site systematically, recover what remained of the aircraft, and look for the 5 men who had never come home. That goal created an unusual engineering problem. The sea dike could not simply be opened because an aircraft happened to lie underneath it. Whatever the historical importance of the wreck, the coast still had to be protected. So before crews could remove the real dike, they had to build another line of defense. A temporary sheet pile water barrier was installed around the recovery area. While the permanent dike was open, this temporary barrier had to take over its protective function. Only after that protection was ready could crews begin cutting into the dike itself. The sequence reversed the normal logic of an aircraft recovery. The Wellington was not being lifted from the sea. Instead, the sea had to be kept outside while the team dug down through the land to reach an aircraft buried beneath the structure built to hold that water back. The scale of the preparation also revealed how completely the crash site had become part of the modern landscape. In 1943, HE346 had struck open coastal ground near the dike. By 2024, the recovery team was not simply returning to an old crater. They were entering a piece of infrastructure that had been raised, strengthened, and maintained for generations after the aircraft disappeared. That meant the operation had to proceed in an order dictated by the dike rather than by the wreck. The water barrier came first. Then the modern dike material could be removed. Only after the protected work area existed could the recovery specialists begin approaching the wartime crash level below. The deeper they went, the character of the job changed. Near the surface, the work belonged largely to modern construction. Farther down, every new layer brought the team closer to a violent event from 1943. The machines could move large quantities of earth, but the moment wreck material appeared, speed could no longer be the only concern. Aircraft parts had to be recognized. dangerous materials separated, and anything that might relate to the crew treated accordingly. Recovery started on July 29, 2024. Almost 100 meters of sea dike were involved in the work. Excavators removed material that had been placed there for one purpose, to protect the coast, in order to expose a landscape that had not been accessible for decades. The deeper the excavation went, the farther the team moved away from the modern surface and back toward the ground level of 1943. Eventually, the work area extended to roughly 8 meters below the surface. That depth was only part of the complication. The Wellington had been a combat aircraft. Ammunition or other explosive material could still be present. Explosive ordnance specialists, therefore, worked alongside the recovery team. The aircraft had also carried 5 missing men. Any human material had to be handled differently from ordinary wreckage or construction debris. The Royal Netherlands Army's recovery and identification specialists were involved for that reason. Aircraft recovery personnel had to recognize wreck components. Explosive specialists had to deal with ammunition hazards. Identification personnel had to be ready if human remains appeared. Civil engineers had to keep the excavation and temporary water defense functioning. Several different jobs were taking place inside the same recovery site, and all of them were governed by a deadline. The dike had to be restored before the beginning of the storm season. By the 1st of October, the temporary situation could not remain. The recovery, therefore, had a fixed window. Historical work had to fit inside the rules of modern flood protection. Once the dike material had been removed, the team began entering the actual crash deposit. HE346 did not emerge as a complete airplane. There was no moment when the outline of a Wellington appeared neatly in the mud. The impact had been too violent and the burial too long. Instead, the aircraft returned in pieces. Material from the excavation had to be examined because a bucket of coastal clay could contain ordinary debris, part of the bomber, ammunition, personal equipment, or evidence connected with the crew. As the work continued, the shape of the buried aircraft became clearer through what came out. Parts of the landing gear were recovered. Radio components appeared. Flying equipment came from the ground. A gun turret was found. So was the aircraft's dinghy. Among the smaller items were a leather flying helmet and an oxygen mask. There were also remnants of ammunition, a reminder that the machine beneath the dike had not been a transport or training aircraft, but a bomber returning from combat. Then came some of the largest pieces. Both engines were recovered. That was a remarkable physical contrast with what had been visible after the crash. In 1943, people at the surface had seen little more than a water-filled impact area, mud, and scattered debris. 81 years later, 2 large engines were being lifted back out of the ground. They did not mean the aircraft had survived intact. They did not turn HE346 into a restoration project. But they showed how much of the bomber had remained below the surface after almost everything recognizable had disappeared from view. The excavation continued. The finds also came at very different scales. A large mechanical component could make its identity obvious as soon as enough of it was exposed. Smaller objects required a different kind of attention. A piece of flying equipment or radio gear might be physically insignificant beside an engine, yet it could connect the recovery much more directly to the people who had occupied the aircraft. That difference mattered at Holwert. The recovery was not being judged by whether the team could assemble the largest possible pile of metal. Each object helped establish what portion of the crash deposit had been reached and what had survived inside it. The large components showed the presence of the bomber. The personal equipment brought the crew back into the same physical space. By then, the excavation had moved far beyond the scattered fragments that had first identified a Wellington decades earlier. The team was working through the concentrated remains of HE346 itself. Each recovered object made the crash site more legible. The team had reached the main wreck deposit. The parts were there, the equipment was there, the aircraft was there in the only form it could still exist. But that was not the reason the Dutch had opened a sea dike. 5 men had vanished with HE346. The recovery program existed because they might still be there too. In September, the work reached that part of the story. Human remains were found in the wreck site. On September 13th, the Dutch Ministry of Defense publicly announced the discovery. The remains were transferred to the Royal Netherlands Army's Recovery and Identification Service for examination at Soesterberg. Finding human remains was not the same as identifying an individual. At the start of the excavation, all 5 members of the Wellington's crew were still officially missing. The material recovered in September could not simply be assigned to Charles Mattress, Alfred Mortimer, John Priestley, Norman Perry, or Thomas Ball without further specialist work. The exact identity remained a separate question. But one thing had changed permanently. The purpose of the excavation was no longer theoretical. For years, people had known that 5 men had disappeared at the crash site. Investigators had recovered fragments and limited human material during earlier work. A memorial had carried the crew's names since 1992. Now, after the dike had been opened and the main wreck deposit excavated, human remains had been recovered from the site itself. The operation had reached the human loss at the center of the case. There was still work to do. The excavation continued through the remaining recovery area while the calendar moved deeper into September. On September 18th, Dutch Defense announced that the recovery of HE346 had been completed. Major parts of the aircraft, personal flying equipment, ammunition remnants, and human remains had all been brought out. But the work was not finished, simply because the last important wreck material had left the excavation. The recovery had begun by temporarily changing the coastal defense. Now that process had to be reversed. The pit was closed. The permanent dike was rebuilt. Only after the sea defense was restored could the temporary barrier stop carrying the responsibility it had taken on at the beginning of the project. The deadline was still the 1st of October. The same engineering logic that had made the recovery possible now brought it to an end. Open the dike only after temporary protection was ready. Recover the aircraft within the permitted window. Then restore the coast before the storm season. When the site returned to its normal appearance, much of the extraordinary work disappeared from view. The deep recovery pit was gone. The temporary barrier was gone. The sea dike once again looked like part of the ordinary Friesland coastline. That ordinary appearance concealed an unusual sequence of events. In June 1943, a Wellington returning from a raid over Germany had come down near Holwert and driven itself so deeply into coastal ground that almost no recognizable aircraft remained on the surface. 5 men disappeared with it. A post-war attempt failed to bring the bomber out. Later dike work exposed fragments and limited human remains. Then strengthening of the sea defense covered the crash site even more completely. Researchers identified the aircraft through structural evidence, wartime records, and personal clues. A memorial gave the 5 missing men a permanent place above ground, but the wreck remained underneath. Then, 81 years after the crash, modern flood engineering and a national recovery program made possible what earlier efforts had not. The Netherlands built a temporary sea defense, opened almost 100 meters of the permanent dike, and dug roughly 8 meters down into the crash site. The engines came out, major wreckage came out, personal equipment came out, and human remains came out. The operation did not produce a complete Wellington that could be restored and flown again. That had never been the objective. It did not answer every question either. The exact final moments of HE346 remain only partly documented. The human remains recovered in 2024 should not be assigned to individual crew members without confirmed identification. But the physical condition of the story changed. For decades, the memorial stood above a bomber that could not be reached without disturbing the structure protecting the coast. In 2024, that barrier was finally opened. For a few weeks, a protected excavation replaced part of the dike, and the ground beneath it was searched layer by layer. Then the dike was rebuilt. Today, there is no enormous recovery pit at Holwert and no exposed Wellington beneath the sky. The coast has returned to its modern purpose. But the absence beneath it is no longer the same. For 81 years, HE346 was an aircraft that had disappeared into the ground. To reach it, the Netherlands had to open the wall that held back the sea. And when that wall was closed again, part of what had been missing since June 1943 had finally come back out.